Hey, it's Rowan, and this is the third and final video in my series about the future of LGBTQ+ cinema. I'm going to leave links to the two other videos along with my Patreon in the description, so you can help support make these videos or series in the future if you would like. So just a quick recap what we've covered so far. In the first video, I looked at the idea of being mainstream. What does that mean? Is it something that we would want to aspire towards? Is this something that we can maybe see in the future of LGBT cinema? In the second video, I created an axis or graph on which we might plot LGBTQ+ cinema or representation in order to compare it to each other and specifically look at the way that that representation is being done rather than just whether it is mainstream or not. And so in this last video I wanted to pull all that together and look towards the future using Love, Simon as a case study and also talking about around 20 other films that are either new releases or soon to be releases to kind of see what we might expect in terms of not just the representation but also the questions and issues that we might be grappling with as representation continues on in the next couple of years. Love, Simon is an adaptation of a novel by Becky Albertalli called Simon vs. the Homo Sapien Agenda. The film was released in 2018 and tells the story of high schooler Simon. After a boy at his school comes out anonymously online under the username Blue, Simon begins sending emails in secret to the other boy, confessing his own sexuality under the pseudonym Jack. When a fellow student Martin finds out about the emails and therefore Simon's sexuality, Martin begins to blackmail Simon. In return for not outing him, Martin asks Simon to set him up with his friend Abby. The plot revolves around Simon keeping his secret, being blackmailed by Martin, and also his developing feelings towards Blue. Now, as you can tell by the title of this video, I'm not Love, Simon's biggest fan, and it's an interesting one because I think in a lot of places online it's quite controversial to talk about not liking Love, Simon. And the reason for that is very tied into some of the initial reasons why I was a little bit hesitant around the film, and that was the way that it was being framed or marketed outside of the film itself. A lot of the coverage around it made it seem like this was the first time that a queer teen had ever been on film, which obviously isn't true, but it means that there are a lot of people who see that and understandably are quite protective over the film and what it might mean. There's a kind of earnest mythology that existed and in a lot of ways still exists around Love, Simon. I've only talked about the film a couple of times online, but each time I get people messaging me really angry at me daring to criticize it at all. I wrote an article for The Pool which talked about all of the other films that had teen LGBT protagonists that had come before Love, Simon, and people were really angry about it. Now I understand how on a surface level that article could be seen as nitpicky. You know, sure, yeah, there are lots of other films, what does it matter, like, stop ruining people's fun. But the thing is, I think it is really important that young people, especially young queer people, who are being told, hey, this is the only film that you are going to have access to, which is going to tell a story which is in any way yours. If it isn't true, if there are other things that they could be watching, if there are other places where they could find stories which show different queer narratives than what Love, Simon does. I also think it does a massive disservice to ignore all of the indie, often queer written and directed stuff that came before Love, Simon, which made Love, Simon possible in the first place. What I really worried about every time a young person would message me annoyed that I had dared to criticise Love, Simon at all because of how much it might mean to young LGBT people is that they thought it had to mean something to them because it was the only thing that could, and that's simply not true. Before I saw the film, I was really careful to separate in my head the frustration that I was having around the way it was being talked about and the film itself. Then I saw the film itself. Love, Simon is a teen romantic comedy, and therefore it's imbued with a certain set of expectations that have come from decades of previous teen romantic comedies. The big difference being, at least in the mainstream, those films have had heterosexual protagonists. And it might seem on the surface like it shouldn't really matter, that we should just be able to drop a gay protagonist into that same storyline and stereotypes and have it work. But that's not necessarily the case. As I mentioned earlier, the second video in this series dealt with a graph or axis on which we can plot different films in terms of their LGBT representation. So the two axes go like this. On one, you go from invisible to incidental to focused, and on the other, you go from condemnation to assimilation to liberation. I don't think anyone can deny that Love, Simon is very focused in terms of its LGBT content. The lead character is gay. But I think it's also important to note that it's a textbook example of the assimilation part of that axis. And that's part of what a lot of people liked about the film. It was nice and fluffy and inoffensive, but for me, it absolutely fell down on the details that these kind of assimilation narratives can often overlook. One of my main gripes with Love, Simon was this sort of heterosexual gaze that it employed. These kind of femme-shaming and internalized homophobia elements of the story that Simon himself perpetuates were never dealt with, they were never addressed, they were never criticized. They were just there. Simon looks at Ethan, the openly gay student in the school who's very feminine and is bullied for it, and thinks, well, why is he bringing it on himself?
Hope it doesn't get caught in your vagina.
Great choice on the cargo pants, by the way. It looks like you got gang banged by a TJ Maxx.
Whatever, fag.
Honestly, it's just not even a challenge anymore.
Dicks.
Wish Ethan wouldn't make it so easy for them.
Yeah, well, at my old school, that would have been settled with a knife fight.
He imagines a fantasy of being out in college using a song and dance number, then cuts it short with verbal nudge and wink to the audience, assuring them, in reality,
yeah, maybe not that gay.
I was really hoping that at some point in the film this was going to get addressed, that Simon was going to talk to one of his friends about the way he'd been feeling and how he'd been acting, that he would apologise to Ethan for it. But that didn't happen. Instead, we never got a point at which a straight audience would have to examine how they themselves might be complicit in a society or microaggressions or situations or conversations that they have had that might make people feel like they had to stay in the closet to the extent that Simon did. A straight audience is never asked to question their initial reaction to a queerness that doesn't necessarily fit into the gender binary either. Love, Simon also manages to get praise for its interracial gay love story, even though the couple's only on screen for a few minutes at the end of the film. And that's during a scene where a gay boy who has been blackmailed about his sexuality for the whole movie then uses a public ultimatum to implore the other to come out, not just to him, but to a fairground full of people who want in on the gossip.
Betty's waiting for the other gay kid. Where's Dana? She'll love this.
The classic heterosexual romantic movie trope of the grand gesture is imposed onto the queer narrative. It doesn't quite fit, but the audience is just kind of told to ignore that. You know, forget about it. They're riding a cute Ferris wheel together. By trying to assimilate the experience of gay teenage boys into this very heteronormative movie trope, you end up having to ignore some of the unique experiences that they might be going through and sacrifice it in the place of just an overall image. And to be clear, for a lot of people, this was a fine sacrifice to make. The idea that, well, we'll just create something that's a bit of fun and some fantasy, but for me, for a few reasons, it left a bitter taste in my mouth. The romantic redemptive gesture in Love, Simon doesn't feel earned because what he's done wrong is not actually to do with the romance he has with Blue. So examples of these, things a romantic character's done wrong in these movies might be something like a boy is boasting to his friends in the locker room about his sexual exploits and inadvertently sets the school rumour mill off against his girlfriend. Or a guy who doggedly pursues the head cheerleader who he really fancies, abandoning the friendship with his also hot but she wears glasses, so is a nerd, best friend until realising at the end that it was her that he wanted the whole time. Or even the guy who makes a bet with his friends that he can sleep with the girl before prom and then learns the error of his ways and actually likes her as a human being. These classic romantic movie narratives clearly show a character who engages in a kind of callous or at least thoughtless action, and that behaviour is entered into more or less freely. And the lead has to learn that it was a shitty thing for them to do, and then they go and try and win the romantic partner back by demonstrating that they have learnt that lesson. But none of that is true of Simon and Blue. In the heterosexual plots, this romantic gesture is something that the other person actively wants. It's probably going to be maybe a callback to something that they've mentioned or talked about wanting or being involved with previously, and is also often directly tied to the behaviour which is messing up the relationship. So the big bravado jock has to humble himself, maybe even do something silly or humiliating in order to show the girl that he doesn't necessarily think that social hierarchy is as important as their relationship.
What is this?
It's closing time by the band Semisonic. It's not Third Eye Blind. Can you believe that?
Not the song. This!
You said you want your life to be like a movie. Sorry I had to use the real Grand Central instead of the fake one.
I mean, it's just plastic. It's really just... Share it. A piece for Gretchen Wieners, a partial spring fling queen. A piece for Janice Ian.
Seriously, most people just take the crown and go.
But the thing that Simon has done wrong in this movie, meddling with his friends' love lives, is not something he entered into freely. It wasn't part of a character flaw that he had. He was being blackmailed. It's a horrible situation that he can see no escape from. The relationship with Blue isn't messed up because of some character flaw that he has. It's messed up because he was outed, and Blue doesn't want to be out, is scared, and worries that continuing a relationship with Simon might mean that he's outed too. What I was really hoping was going to happen towards the end of the film is that his friends who had abandoned him when all of this came out would come back and realise that actually he'd been in a pretty impossible situation. But instead the film treats it like it is entirely Simon's fault, as if the thing that he should have done was suck it up, be outed, rather than betray his friends. Furthermore, the big romantic gesture where Simon asked Blue to out himself publicly, not just to Simon in private, after the whole reason why they've stopped communicating is because Blue is not ready to be out, is an extension of the idea that for gay characters to develop, they have to realise that coming out isn't really that big of a deal, or at least that it's a decision that it's fine for someone else to make for you, which is no! Even the key emotional crux scene of the movie, where Simon and his mother have a tearful conversation, ended up feeling to me as the movie giving us yet another example of why he shouldn't have been worried about coming out in the first place. It ignores the reality of coming out worries by giving characters these fears and then treating them as completely baseless. And here's the thing, I completely understand wanting to show narratives and worlds in which there isn't any homophobia and that it's just a really happy, positive LGBTQ+ story. But again, that's not really what they were doing here. We've established within this world that homophobia does exist. This isn't some wonderful utopia where coming out isn't a big deal. It's clearly a big deal. It just makes no sense to me that they've created a world in which even Simon looks down on other gay people. But they also seem to be saying that coming out fears are a kind of teen exaggeration or naivety, that your character development is realising that they don't matter. On the surface, Love, Simon is a film that dared to allow a same-sex couple the sort of glossy, applaud-worthy kiss that we've seen from our straight counterparts for years. But do we ignore the implications of the entire plot up till that point, up to that ending, in favour of just praising the visual image it gives us without looking at any of the connotations or implications behind it? For me, I don't think I can. In recent years, Love, Simon has absolutely encapsulated all of the feelings and kind of little difficulties that I've had with the conversation around mainstream cinema, specifically the idea that success for LGBT representation is simply to be mainstream. It creates this veneer of acceptance, either through being very schmaltzy or being quite tragic. The idea of, oh well, we're telling your sad story, therefore we must respect you, or we're basically putting you into a heteronormative plot, therefore we must respect you. And I think the difficulty comes when you dig even slightly deeper than that and look at what's actually going on beneath and the messages we can draw from it. So if the future of LGBTQ+ cinema isn't just to simply say, make it mainstream, what does the future look like? So first, let's look at some genres and tropes that we can see across multiple films that are coming up in the next couple of years. So I went into research mode a bit with this video and started to look at films that were new releases, that were up and coming, that were being released at a festival that might not actually have a general release for a few years. We can never tell with these kind of things. And some really interesting patterns started to emerge of particular genres or tropes that we could see across more than one, oftentimes 5 or 6 different films that were coming up. We're going to talk about 5 such tropes or topics now. The first being, in honour of Love, Simon, teen protagonists. Booksmart is a teen comedy with a lesbian co-lead. Her sexuality is seen as no big deal. It's not the butt of the joke, and she's mentioned to have come out 2 years ago with no big drama. Instead, it focuses on the friendship she has with her straight best friend, and the 2 relationships that they have separately are treated with equal weight in the film itself. There's also What If It's Us? This has been described kind of when it got announced as like the next big gay rom-com. It was originally a book that was co-written by the woman Becky Albertalli, who also wrote Simon versus the Homo sapien Agenda, and is about 2 teen boys who meet at a New York post office. Giant Little Ones is a story about a teen boy called Frankie whose father has just come out. After a night of drunken experimentation with his male friend, Frankie finds himself being outed, but that is seen as just the beginning of his journey to discover his own identity. And of course, I could not mention Rafiki. This is a Kenyan film about 2 students who fall in love and have to balance their happiness and their safety in their conservative neighbourhood. It was actually banned in Kenya for its supposed intent to promote lesbianism, contrary to the law. It's done the rounds of festivals including Cannes and is actually now available to rent online. Now obviously these films were in production before the release of Love, Simon. It wasn't the case that they saw the popularity of Love, Simon and then decided to put them into production. These are films that are all kind of coming up together. What I'm kind of hoping is that with the success of Love, Simon, we have realised that actually it is not necessarily a negative thing towards your film to be talking openly about the queerness of its characters. And with studies in the last few years indicating that young people are more and more likely to identify as something other than straight, we have this growing target audience for this kind of film that I'm really hoping that more filmmakers start to take advantage of. I think especially for teenagers and young people, having a kind of vast variety and diversity of different stories being told is really important, because I think it is particularly important for that age group to be able to see stories around people who look like them or their friends or their experiences. I think that fiction is a way in which people can process what their life is like, what's happening to them, that they can see that other people have empathy towards them and also create empathy towards other people in return. It's no coincidence that YA, or the young adult genre, which is basically just a genre of books which is essentially marketed at teens, although it does have an older readership as well, it's really one of the only genres where the protagonist is the same as the intended reading audience. You can have adult books with adult protagonists or teen or child protagonists in it. You can have children's books with like animal protagonists, adult protagonists, whereas with teenagers and YA, specifically one of the, I guess, definitions that I see of YA is that it has to have a teenage protagonist. And I guess you could read that as like selfish teenagers only want to read about themselves. But I think that when you're developing that sense of self-identity, that it's extremely important to have these images of people who are going through experiences that you might be in a world that might feel particularly overwhelming or difficult. Almost always at panels about young adult literature, and I've been to a lot of them. I work in YA literature outside of YouTube, and I did my dissertation on YA literature. Almost always when it's a panel where there's at least one LGBT person on it, they'll get asked the question, do you think we should move on from coming out stories? Do you think we have enough coming out stories? Shouldn't we be done with coming out stories? And I think that again and again, the answer, and I think it's entirely the right one, is that no, coming out is going to develop and change as we move forwards. And we don't want a generation of young queer people to just see the coming out stories from people years ago, before there was social media, for example, and the way in which that might be affecting them. What happens when being gay is not, you know, you can get married and be gay in your country. How might that change the relationship to coming out versus someone who didn't think that was a possibility when they were coming out? I think that we're always going to have these interesting experiences that we want to portray on film, and I think it's no bad thing to have multiple films about queer teens which are up and coming through the pipeline. So number 2 in our upcoming genres is historical queer ladies. Repressed period drama romance. Haha, classic lesbians. So obviously this is another one like the popularity of Love, Simon. I guess we have the popularity of The Favourite. Again, a lot of these films were at least in production before The Favourite came out and was kind of heralded with such critical acclaim. What I'm really hoping is that the popularity of The Favourite is going to hype up these films rather than become a sort of cursed comparison to them, that people are always going to be like, oh, well, it's not quite as good as The Favourite, as if there can only be one good film in this genre. So with films like Tell It to the Bees, this tender period drama is set in post-war Britain. A friendship between two women grows into something more after one is evicted with her son and the other takes her in. Interestingly enough, when we talk about films that are set historically, often there's an idea that with queer characters they have to be kind of tragic because we're trying to do historical accuracy. What's interesting about this film is that the original novel it was based on, that was written by a lesbian author, had a happy ending, and the filmmakers have been criticised for changing it to be a sad one instead. There's also Portrait of a Lady on Fire. This historical drama is set in France in the 1700s. An affection grows between a painter and the woman that she has been asked to paint. The kind of twist in the tale, I guess, is that she is painting her wedding portrait and they know that they'll have to go their separate ways once the portrait is complete and she has to marry a man. There's also Benedetta, which is based on the life of the nun Benedetta Carlini, who was a famous Catholic nun who had supernatural experiences and a relationship with a woman. There's also Vita and Virginia, so this is, I guess the title sort of gives it away, a historical drama portraying the romantic relationship between Vita Sackville-West and Virginia Woolf, a relationship that was the inspiration for Woolf's famous novel Orlando. There's also a kind of weird version of this genre in Wild Nights with Emily. This is an Emily Dickinson biopic comedy based on her private letters that you, I guess, didn't know you wanted until now. And it's not to be confused with the new TV series Dickinson, which has a similar queer comedic focus on Emily Dickinson's life. I think as I'm filming this, Dickinson, its first episode I think is like literally just aired, but not on a network that I have access to, so sucks to be me, I guess, because it looks hilarious. I'm actually really interested in those last two. It's fascinating to me that almost at the same time we can have these two pieces of media which are talking about the same person in such a specific way, of like a queer comedic way to talk about Emily Dickinson. What a wild ride. So the third kind of genre is, I guess, an interesting kind of similar one to this, which is the idea of like forgotten or invisible women. So right now, with what's happening in the world, it does seem like it's kind of ripe for the stories of, you know, this woman was not appreciated in her time, let us tell you the story of what she did for the world that you should appreciate. Obviously, I think Hidden Figures was an exemplary version of this, and I think its legacy is potentially going to allow us to see more of these come out around different women, including queer women. And I think also within the prominence of the Me Too movement, these conversations around, oh, this person who's been accused, these accusations could ruin their career, we're really starting to look at, well, actually, what about all of people's potential careers that were snuffed out by that person's actions? It's a real recipe for the idea of like forgotten, marginalised people who need to be talked about more. So an example of this is Ammonite, which is a story of Mary Anning. If you don't know who Mary Anning is, oh my, pause this video and go and Google her because she is so fascinating. She was essentially a fossil hunter who was extremely prolific. She made multiple discoveries but was never really celebrated in her lifetime. Due to the sexism at the time, she wasn't accepted within the scientific community, even though she was doing incredible work. Now what's interesting about Ammonite is that it depicts her relationship with another woman, even though, as far as I can tell in my research, there's no evidence of her having a relationship with any women. There's no evidence of her being queer. However, there isn't an overwhelming evidence that she was just straight instead. It's a really interesting addition to me of this discussion of, you know, well, if we can't say with certainty that a historical figure is queer, then we can't say for certain that they were straight either. Although, like, maybe it's worth mentioning, she never got married, and also she was obsessed with her dog and, like, was a stone cold scientific badass, which, like, I don't know, seems pretty gay to me. And I think that this feels quite reminiscent of the film Lizzie from last year, which inserted a kind of queer element to the story of the Borden murders. It also had some similarities to Colette, which was a film from last year that I'm actually going to talk a little bit more detail about later in this video, that was about a woman who very famously ghost wrote for her husband, so he took the credit for her work. I also want to mention a short film now. I think that we can really see within short film, because it doesn't rely on such a massive budget or kind of time commitments and things like that, that feature films do, we potentially see less gatekeeping in terms of the topics that can be covered within short films, and may see bubbling to the surface some ideas that people would then want to develop into features in the future. So I think going to film festivals, looking at short films either online or that are in competition, is a really interesting way of looking at where the conversation might go next. There's indeed a short film called, literally, Invisible Women, which is about two lesbians who were part of the Gay Liberation Front who brought women's rights and the kind of women's agenda to the forefront of that organisation. We just love lesbian pioneers, am I right? So the fourth one I want to talk about is male biopics. So obviously we had Bohemian Rhapsody and Freddie Mercury. We've now also had Rocket Man and Elton John. Again, when I started to script this video, that film wasn't out yet. I really like Rocket Man. I thought it was a lot of fun. I thought it was kind of interesting the differences between a biopic that had involvement of someone who was still alive versus, I guess, the Bohemian Rhapsody version of a biopic, which is about someone who has died but with the involvement of people who had a vested interest in that story, aka the rest of the people from Queen. I don't know if someone's done a comparison between those two films. Surely someone on YouTube has. I would love to hear about it if they have, because that sounds fascinating. There's kind of an interesting link between these two films in that Dexter Fletcher, who directed Rocket Man, was the director that was brought on to finish after Bryan Singer was fired from Bohemian Rhapsody. And Dexter Fletcher also directed Eddie the Eagle, which your boy Taron was in. Taron was also in Kingsman 2, which Elton John featured in as himself, so it's all coming full circle. We also have a recent release in Boy Erased. This movie's based on a memoir by Jared Conley. It tells the story of a teenage boy forced into gay conversion therapy. It's got a bit of a star-studded cast in that Nicole Kidman and Russell Crowe play the boy's parents. So what I think is interesting about biopics and queer people is that because we don't necessarily have this longevity and this train of knowledge around our history, again, I've made videos on this, copious videos on this, if you want to hear me talk more about that, but essentially the idea that our history hasn't been taught in schools. In fact, often in a lot of countries it's been specifically banned to even talk, let alone teach, about being gay or gay history in schools, that we don't necessarily have a lot of LGBT dedicated museum spaces or archivist spaces. In London, for example, we don't have any museums that are dedicated specifically to LGBT history. And obviously from the point of view of a member of the public, that means that we aren't able to actually go to the museum, but it also means that there's not necessarily a centralized space in which these kind of pieces of source material or documentation can be preserved and kept. We also have in, you know, the 80s and 90s, a time at which more and more people had access to these documentary making devices around their own lives, that they could take pictures or use camcorders to take video, that wasn't necessarily preserved and passed down, specifically because of things like the AIDS crisis, where people's possessions might go into the hands of homophobic family members or people who'd want it to be destroyed. There's various reasons why I think biopics and queer people have a really interesting mix to them, and I think it'd be really interesting to see whether there are any upcoming films like this that are really conscious of that particular issue or potential issue. I think it's also interesting to look at the other, I guess, biopics that we've had or films about queer history in some way, so multiple real life people being portrayed. Stonewall being a really obvious one, where the filmmaker sort of made a fictionalized white male gay protagonist to talk about the Stonewall riots that had queer people of colour at the forefront, particularly trans women of colour. How far can a lack of accurate documentation mean that we fall back onto the default of casting, you know, white and male and able-bodied and cisgender? And the fifth and last genre I'm going to talk about in this particular section of the video is the rom-com. So there is one in particular that's coming out that I really wanted to talk about because it's the season of the trailer for Netflix holiday special rom-com. Vanessa Hudgens I think she's like 3 different people in this latest film that she's going to be in for Netflix. What a wild ride, you know? So the film I want to talk about is called Happiest Season. Do you know, it's actually quite sad that I'm getting this excited about a holiday gay rom-com, because like there are so many of them that straight people have, and we got one and I'm like, wow, how have we been so blessed? But we have been, because it's being directed by Claire Duvall and it is starring Mackenzie Davis and Kristen Stewart. What? It's about a woman who goes to her girlfriend's family's house for Christmas and she's planning on proposing, and then she finds out when she arrives that her girlfriend isn't out to her family yet. See, I haven't seen the movie yet, but there is something really interesting to me in the premise of having that classic story of going to meet your in-laws or future in-laws or your partner's family in some way, and the inherent sort of power dynamics and hijinks that can have, but then specifically having a queer twist to it, a situation in which, you know, only LGBT people could be in. So we've talked about Love, Simon. We've also talked about how films like Love, Simon and others are influencing what's coming next and the different kind of genres and stories that are going to be told in the future of LGBTQ+ cinema. And so in the final part of this video, what we're going to be looking at is some tricky questions or ideas which are potentially going to affect the LGBT representation that we have over the next few years. So the first is, what is the relationship between the future of LGBTQ+ representation and cinema and the future of LGBTQ+ filmmakers? In 2017, GLAAD launched this mentorship and grant program for LGBTQ+ filmmakers. The CEO and president of GLAAD, Sarah K. Ellis, saying, "Our vision is to support and inspire content creators to tell stories that accelerate acceptance of LGBTQ+ people here at home and around the world." So what it seems like GLAAD is interested in is the stories that are being put out, that what they're prioritizing is LGBTQ+ kind of acceptance through cinema, rather than necessarily funding LGBTQ+ people and filmmakers to make films about anything that they want. In the UK, at the BFI, or the British Film Institute, in 2015, they launched a mentorship program for LGBTQ+ filmmakers. And as far as I can tell from that, they have no obligation to make LGBTQ+ content at the end of it. It's that classic question of the relationship between what goes on behind and in front of the camera. Does it matter that we have amazing representation of women in front of the camera, for example, if all of the people who are making the films are men? I think people would agree that there's something really interesting and special around Black Panther, because it had black people, most notably Ryan Coogler, behind the scenes as well. There was a sense of community and authenticity around that film that felt really special. For me, the answer to this question is complex. I don't think that we should limit LGBTQ+ filmmakers or straight filmmakers to only make stories about their particular sexuality. But I do think it's probably important that we acknowledge a kind of imbalance there. I don't think I've ever heard of a film which had a majority of queer people behind and in front of the camera that has been in any way mainstream. But like, my lord, have we heard of a lot of straight films with straight people in front of them behind the camera that were mainstream, you know? So the second question is around marketing. Namely, is this something we should put into marketing? Is the sexuality or gender identity of the characters important to put into the marketing of the film so that people know about it before they go and see the film itself? If we think that people are potentially less likely to go and see a film if we have open LGBTQ+ representation within the trailers or the marketing for it, for example, then are we essentially shooting ourselves in the foot if we want more studios to be investing in these kind of stories? Is it better to have people discover that it's LGBT once they're in the cinema but have paid to go and see it? On a more social level, is it good for those kind of people to go into the cinema and see an empathetic story around a queer protagonist? In many ways, last year was a breakthrough year in LGBT representation in the mainstream, including the nomination of films like Green Book and Can You Ever Forgive Me at the Academy Awards. Although you would be forgiven for not realising that those two films had any LGBTQ plus representation in them at all if you had just been looking at the trailers or the coverage of the films and not seen them. In Green Book, the character of Don Shirley, who is based on an actual man who didn't come out in his lifetime, is arrested for having sex with another man.
His friend's here. Thank you.
Get a guy a towel, for Christ's sake.
Now, the real-life Tony Lip, who's played by Viggo Mortensen in the film, has said that that was based on an actual event that happened while they were travelling together. And in the film itself, that's seen as an isolated mention of his sexuality. So in some ways, you could understand people not talking about it in the trailer or marketing. The idea that it was for one shocking scene, it wasn't something that's really addressed within the film is more specifically focused on race. Or is that itself an example of a misstep that the film took in assuming that those things, race and sexuality, for that character could be so easily separated? Can You Ever Forgive Me is about a writer who attempts to reinvigorate her failing career by forging letters from deceased writers. This film again was based on real people, a lesbian and a gay man and their friendship together, although again, watching the trailers, that's not something you necessarily would have picked up on. And on one hand you can argue, well, this is the kind of story that a lot of people do want. The idea of, well, we have gay characters, but being gay is not the most important or interesting thing about them. But by not mentioning it at all, to me, it could just as easily be so that they wouldn't put off potential audiences. The third question is around tragic endings. Although there has been a lot of criticism of things like the bury your gays trope, of these tragic endings that seem to befall so many LGBTQ plus characters, I guess the question is, do we want to completely try and step away from that and maybe risk not addressing some of the very real problems, concerns and marginalisations that exist across our community now and have done in the past? Last year, Benjamin Lee wrote about his experiences as a juror at a gay film festival, saying, "I've been reminded of the bleakness that has come to typify LGBT cinema." Now, I've talked about this before in other videos. I think I'm going to have to make a list in the description of the other videos that I've mentioned throughout this one, just in case you want to kind of go and have a look at that and delve more deeper. But essentially, it's no accident that there are tragic endings to queer stories. This isn't a big coincidence. There's a very, very long history, very notably for the film industry in particular, the Hays Code, which was a kind of morality code brought in by Hollywood itself for fear that the US government would put on more harsh moral sanctions onto films. So they basically put out a list of things that were acceptable and unacceptable to have in film and a way of dealing with particular topics. And amongst many others was the idea that sympathy could not be seen to be on the side of a kind of evildoer or a sinful person. And gay people were very much within that. So either you were not allowed to show gay people at all, or if you did, you had to show them being punished or having an inherently sad or tragic life in order to justify their involvement within the film. And that is something that has kind of continued with a sort of snowball effect to mean that nowadays people who don't even know about the Hays Code have been absolutely affected by the way in which the cinema that they've grown up with has portrayed gay people. Is there a difference between a gay or trans person writing a tragic story based on their experiences or the experiences of their friends or community versus a straight or cis person writing a tragic ending because that's just what they've seen replicated before? Especially because stories around tragic endings or dead queer and trans people do quite well when award season comes around. Is there a balance that we can come to between showing the kind of hurt and grit and difficulties that are authentic to these kind of lives while still having a hopeful ending? Would it be desirable to have a balance between portraying the kind of reality of violence or grit or difficulties that we might have within stories of our community while also giving it a hopeful ending? So the next question is around whether queer roles should be portrayed by queer actors. Whitewashing in film is now rightfully being called out, but should the same be said for queer roles and queer actors? Does it even matter? I think it's interesting to note that of the actors involved in the LGBT films nominated for Oscars this year, none of them are queer that I know of themselves. Coleman, Weiss, Stone, Ali, McCarthy, Grant, Malick, all straight cisgender actors being praised and rewarded for playing queer roles. In a lot of upcoming queer movies, the actors are indeed straight. In a particularly notable example, in the new Disney movie Jungle Cruise, which is meant to have the first openly gay character in a Disney movie, which is a pretty monumental event, that character, in the little information we have about him, has kind of been shown to be the comic relief because he's very camp, and the actor who's portraying him is a straight British comedian who's, you know, not an insignificant vibe of his comedy is, wow, how funny is it that my dad thinks I'm gay? Not exactly promising to say the least. On the one hand, people will say, well, the whole point of an actor's job is to be able to portray people that they're not. You don't have to be a murderer to play a murderer, do you? A chorus to all together. But I think it can also leave a bitter taste in a lot of people's mouths that there are so many straight actors who are not just permitted to play gay characters, but actively praised and rewarded for it, particularly in films written and directed by other straight people, when queer actors are so often sidelined for both queer and straight roles. As Ian McKellen pointed out a few years ago, no openly gay men had ever won an Oscar for acting, but plenty of straight men had for playing often tragic gay characters, including Tom Hanks, Philip Seymour Hoffman, and Sean Penn. I don't think it's inherently limiting for gay actors to play gay roles. I think it's the added issue of the disproportionate lack of LGBTQ+ roles available at all. I think for me there's always this element of exasperation, and like I should have a bingo card up with the things that straight actors are going to say around portraying gay roles. Personal favourites. This isn't a gay love story, this is just a love story. Or an interviewer being like, wow, it's so brave of you to step into a role like this. And that leads us on to trans representation. Now, I know that at the moment we are still having this conversation around the idea that, you know, could we have a trans woman but played by a cis man? Is that okay? I think at this point in the conversation, overwhelmingly people are like, no, for various reasons, including the idea that it perpetuates this myth around trans women, which is still very real and has very real dangers to it in the real world, that they are just like men in dresses. However, as we look to the future beyond that, I think it's interesting looking at films like Colette, for example, which I mentioned earlier, in terms of where the future of trans representation could be. Colette's director cast like people of colour in historically white roles, he cast queer actors in straight roles and vice versa, and he also cast trans actors in cis roles. He said of his decision, "During the process, I went to a transgender casting workshop where I met many trans actors, including Jake Graff. Several people said, we don't just want to play trans, we want to play cis too." What I'm hoping is with the casting decisions and experiences of recent shows like Pose and the OA, these myths that we've previously had around the idea that there are just simply not enough trans actors to fill these roles is going to melt away. In the OA, for example, there is a character who was written specifically as an Asian American trans masculine character. And when the casting director said, well, we don't know if we're going to be able to find someone like that, can we compromise? The showrunners basically said, no, go out and find them. And so what happened was that they went to the places in which young trans like boys might be. So for example, Tumblr, which is where they found Ian Alexander, who is a fantastic actor who has just done wonders in that role. Similarly with Pose, you have a TV show where the majority of the cast are trans women of colour, played by trans women of colour. What I'm really hoping is these more non-traditional casting processes are going to allow us to feel like you aren't being limited by having a trans character who has to be played by a trans person, but that's an opportunity to find new and exciting talent. And the last question that I think is going to be feeding into conversations around the future of LGBTQ+ cinema is how we look at the intersections of identities and underrepresented identities within our community. So for example, how does disability intersect with our community? How does class or race intersect with our community? There are actually two examples of recent short films that have been screening at festivals which dig into this a little bit. First is Anemone, about a Nigerian teenager who is searching for ways to express their non-binary identity. The short was actually written and directed by Amru Al-Kadi, who is someone who I've quoted in a previous video in this series. There's also films like Dressed for Pleasure, which is about a young disabled queer woman who is trying to kind of exert her own independence under the protective roof of her parents. And I think the questions that come with these is, are we going to have a similar period of having to look at what non-gay people's version of a gay story is, for example, before we allow actual gay people to tell their own stories? Do we have to go through this kind of problematic representation before we get to something that feels authentic? Or in the future, will we be seeing actual, non-binary filmmakers or disabled filmmakers able to tell their own stories? I think a large part of that is going to involve more than just people's goodwill. It doesn't really matter if you say, well, of course, people who are disabled should be able to be making movies, but if we don't have an element of accessibility on sets, not just specifically catered to disabled people, but in sets in general, so that disabled people can be hired within those sets and their accessibility needs are met, how can we expect them to be able to get the experience to get to a level where they can be producing their own films? When filmmakers at film festivals, or even places like VidCon, or on panels saying, well, anyone can be a filmmaker because, in your pocket you've probably got the latest iPhone and you can film on that, just buy a couple of lenses and put it on that and you can make your own feature. You know, other people have done it. This assumption that everyone is going to have not just the latest iPhone, but an iPhone at all, a film at all that's capable of that kind of quality, that is something that's automatically a barrier of entry to the film industry for people who don't have that kind of income. So I think at the end of this process, after all of this research that I've been doing, all the films I've been looking at these new ways of thinking about LGBT cinema that I've come up with, at looking towards the future, asking questions about the industry that I think will be coming up, I've been thinking about what I think the future of queer cinema is, but also what I hope it can be. I think that we're inevitably going to have these sweeping mainstream examples which we are going to have issues with and criticisms of, and I absolutely think it's important to be holding people to account and to be looking at those criticisms. But I also think there's a really positive thing that we can do as a community in order to create the future of queer cinema that we want, and that is investing in a level of accessibility to people who are trying to make this kind of cinema, and then also supporting the kind of cinema that we want to be made. I want the future of queer cinema to be expansive. I want it to be telling everyone's stories. And I think that that's not something that's just going to happen by accident. We need to be looking at holding people to account. We need to be looking at accessibility and access to the film industry, to creating films from all different angles. Physical accessibility, accessibility that revolves around disability, but also how welcome particular groups feel, especially those that have been underrepresented before. But I think it's also quite true that that's not something that people outside of the industry necessarily have the ability to get involved in. You see things like work experience placements that assume that people who come into them are already going to have their own equipment with them. I think it's really the responsibility of the people who are within the industry, both on a very mainstream level, but also just working on making their own films, in order to look at, okay, well, who am I bringing into the fold? Who am I giving opportunities to? Who am I giving, shadowing opportunities to, paid opportunities to? Are they just my own group of friends? Are they people who look like me, who sound like me, who have the same experiences as me? And if not, like, how do I reach out to people who are outside of that bubble? As I said, this isn't something that's just the job of big companies to be doing. If you're a YouTuber, for example, a lot of YouTubers now hire editors or writing assistants or people to help them. If you're putting that kind of job ad out and all the responses you're getting are from white men, it might not be that it's because the only people who can edit or write are white men. It might be something to do with the application that you've put out, the way you've worded it, the fact that you haven't put a specific salary down, the fact that you've only been putting it out through your networks. You haven't been reaching out to other people to say, hey, here's an opportunity, I think your network might be interested. You haven't specified in the ad that you aren't just looking for a certain kind of person. It takes a lot of effort to do that. And I think when you don't do it, it just seems like, well, I've done my best, I put it out there, it's not my fault if other people didn't come to me. I think it just takes a tiny effort from people across different areas of these industries in order to potentially make a really big difference. There are also things that anyone can do, you can do, which don't involve you being involved within an industry at all. So one of the main things is obviously vote with your dollars, vote with your feet, go and see the films that are important to you, the films you want to see more of, stream them, download them, use the buying power that you do have to show what you're invested in. I completely understand that for a lot of people, where you live means that you might not even get any kind of queer cinema being shown on your screens, in which case that's not something you can do. Or you're someone who can't afford to go to the cinema. So other things you can do are talk about these films, spread the word, both in person and online. You can search on things like Kickstarter or film funding websites for films that you think are really important and either donate or kind of retweet or spread the word, post about them as well. If you live in a town or city that does film festivals, a lot of places will give concession and even free tickets, especially if they're sort of queer and DIY festivals. But looking at what's screening, seeing if there's any films that really excite you, especially because a lot of those films may not get a mainstream release. And a lot of the filmmakers will be at those events. Talk to them, say how much those films mattered to you. I've had some really amazing conversations and made some really great friends by talking on my channel about queer art that I loved, and had those filmmakers, actors, writers come back to me and say how much they appreciated that. There are so many people making amazing free queer short films on YouTube and Vimeo that you can look at. Watch them, comment, like, interact with them in a way that might boost it up the algorithm so more people will be able to see them. And finally, share your recommendations with others. And reach out and ask if people have recommendations, if there are particular films or identities, experiences that you would love to see on screen. In the future, I don't want there to be a repeat of this sort of Love Simon idea of this is the one film and that's the end of your journey. I want there to be a really healthy community around queer filmmaking, both in terms of the filmmaking itself, but also in terms of the audience. That we can say, yes, we are here, we want to watch your stuff, and help other people find it too. Well, we have reached the end of this series. Thank you so much for watching. Again, I'm going to leave a link to my Patreon Patreon in the description. If you want to help me make videos like this, then check it out. I'm also going to leave my Twitter and Instagram if you want to come say hi there. In the comments, let me know what you think about any of the stuff we've covered. There's obviously a lot of questions that have been brought up, but specifically if you have any recommendations of films, either short films or features, that you think people should absolutely check out, please leave them in the comments. I would love to have a little look through them and watch as many as possible. And until I see you next time, bye.